Why does it happen? Why do people get divorced?
In my experience, I think, unfortunately, many divorces probably could be prevented, but I think what often happens is people live in a relationship that is unsatisfying for a long period of time until it reaches a point that the only escape, the only sense of my happiness becomes I have to escape from this, rather than to work earlier on and figuring out what led to the breakdown in communication. But I think when people can't communicate and aren't happy, they think about divorce. And certainly in our culture, it's very easy. Get a divorce, get something new.
At what stage could it have been prevented? Like you were saying, are they doomed from the start?
No, I think that, one of the ways that I work is I utilize the work of Harville Hendricks a lot, who talked about, he wrote a very famous book a long time ago called Getting the Love You Want. And he developed a process called imagotherapy. And it typically works best around 7, 8 years into a marriage. This is when people come for help. That's why it's called the 7 year itch. It's when people get married for all kinds of reasons that he talks about. But what brings people together? Why do they choose the person that they choose? And very often, the very things that attracted people to one another are the things they end up fighting about 7 years later. And so, if they get help at that 7, 8, somewhere in there to figure it out, there's a much better chance that that marriage could survive. When they don't, and often they don't get the help then it just gets more and more entrenched until the point at which they just can't live together. And then people think about decoupling and separating and divorcing.
Why is it that number though? Why seven or eight?
I think what happens in my experience is it takes 7, 8 years. People go through that honeymoon phase at the beginning. Everything feels wonderful. We're attracted physically. It's kind of this magical honeymoon experience. And then, you're busy with your careers and you might be buying a house, you might be having some kids. So people are very busy during those early years. So, whether it's 6 or 7 or 8, it's not a magical number. It's just that after you've had quite a bit of experience already that in that building phase, and then the reality sets in that, we don't communicate very well, or you don't understand me the way I thought you did. That's why I think it's that number.
Is it 7 or 8 years since they got married, or is it like 7, 8 years since the start of the relationship?
In my experience, I think it's when they get married. Marriage introduces a whole new set of variables to a couple's relationship, which is different when you're not married, I think. And I see
Why
that.
is that though? There are plenty of relationships where everything's going fine. All of a sudden they get married. A lot of times they don't even have kids and everything just goes wrong.
Yeah. You do see that a lot. And I think it's because there's an extra sense of commitment, there's an extra set of responsibilities that come along with getting married that people understand. And the families of those people are involved at that point, and all kinds of expectations. And depending on the culture, all kinds of expectations when you get married. And people balk. And, once they're down the road and they're feeling, this isn't really what I wanted, this isn't what I bargained for. And most people find that, by the way, in any relationship or marriage, that it isn't what we thought it was going into it. It changes over time. And I think that's the benefit of therapy, is that people learn, there's this concept called marriage mapping or love mapping, that how it evolves over years. Because the things that make a marriage work at year 10 are not the same things that carry people to 40 years of marriage, 50 years of marriage. And I'm not talking about previous generations where they just stayed together because they had to stay together. I mean, people have really successful marriages. And we don't have a handbook for marriage. That's part of the problem. We don't have a handbook for marriage. We don't have a handbook for raising children.
Why don't we come up with a handbook?
That's a good question.
No,
um,
really, like what, Jeff, why don't you write one?
that's a good question. I did write a book, which kind of incorporates my thinking. How many people will read that book? I don't know. I think people are reluctant to read and to learn about these kinds of things. There are many, religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques, that they have mandated programs. If you want us to marry you, we want you to take a course, a premarital course. That used to be very popular. I don't think it's as much anymore because I think there are a lot of things people could learn. Um, we require people to take courses and get their driver's license to drive a car, but you don't really need any training to get married or to have kids.
Why has that not happened though? Isn't that crazy? Like the examples you just gave, like driving, everything, you have a license. And marriage is probably like, and they say the most important decision, and the wedding's the most important day, blah, blah, blah. And how long have humans have been around for what, 200,000 years? No book on marriage and especially raising kids.
Yeah, I think
Why?
it's a good question. I think that partly in our culture, Western culture, there's this idea that somehow we're supposed to know it all. We're just supposed to wing it and we're supposed to be self-sufficient. And if we need to go to people to help us, there's something wrong with us. I think there's still some stigma around that for people that come to see me. There's stigma that there's somehow there must be something wrong with them that they need this help. And I try to explain that therapy is a shortcut to growth. It in fact teach you some of those teachable skills that you might have never learned. But I don't think people typically go looking for that. I think we like to think we're good at what we do and we don't need anybody to tell us.
Jeff, really though? I mean, like people ask for help all the time now. No? Like, I mean, I know everybody I know is doing some sort of therapy. They don't even need it. They're just doing it for fun. And it's covered by their insurance. So they're like, whatever, I get 80% coverage. I'll just do it. Mental health is like the talk of the day, no? Everyone's reaching out to somebody.
It is, but I think there's still a stigma. I think there's still this in Western culture. I think there's still this idea that somehow I should know, or if I don't know, there's something wrong with me. And especially men. I think men have a much harder time asking for help than women. I think it's much more acceptable for women to think about going and talking about their feelings and asking for help. They're usually the ones that are the instigators of the marital therapy. It's not the husbands.
Are women reaching out to therapy because it's easier for them to ask for help, or is it because they're more unhappy in the relationship?
I think it's easier for women to talk about their feelings. I think if I were to gauge unhappiness, they're different. I think men are unhappy in a marriage in a different way than women are unhappy in a marriage. They're both high degrees of unhappiness, but the way it gets expressed is very different. I think typically what I see is men investing themselves in their work as a replacement for what they're not getting at home. And
Workaholic types.
either workaholics or just they just put their energy into their work, and whatever it is at home is just that's what it is at home. They put up with it. They're very unhappy. Most of them will tell me that they don't have sex very much, and that they don't like. For women, I think the sex is less important than the emotional connection, and I think they feel very sad and unhappy when there's a lack of emotional intimacy. So that's more a women thing. The men are struggling because they're not getting enough sex, and we always say that men need sex to feel loved, and women are the opposite. They need to feel loved to have sex. So that you can see already there's this mixed message about men and women being together in a marriage.
But these men who are not getting enough sex, let's say, when they did get married or when their relationship started, they found their partner sexy and they were,
Sure.
yeah, right? What happened? What changed? Did the partner just let themselves go or what?
Well, if I think about Harville Hendricks and his theory that, and I'll give you an example. This guy, let's say he's in the television industry and he travels around the world and lives a very exciting life. And he meets this woman who's a school teacher. And she's very set in her ways. She paid off her mortgage. And they fall in love because he finds her really rooted and responsible. She finds him very exciting. Well, 7 years later, sure enough, those are the very things they're fighting about. Now she's saying he's irresponsible. He's so spontaneous. He's saying you're boring. And then what we talk about is the thing that brought you together is that you liked what that other person brought to the table. You thought somehow your life would become the perfect life that you wanted because you now have that person. In fact, what it really indicates is that's an area that you need to develop in your life. And so with this couple, we talked about him giving her wings and her giving him roots. Well, now the work becomes how does he develop his own roots, not fighting with her about hers, because that's what attracted him to her, and vice versa. So for her to develop her own sense of excitement and not to look to him to fill that void for her. And so those are the things that they end up fighting about, and then they disconnect. Because when we feel our partner doesn't understand us or we're arguing, we shut down. We just shut down. And men do that much easier than women. Women tend to shut down physically. Men shut down emotionally. They kind of disappear and they go into their den, they just stop communicating.
Is it a physical attraction thing? Could it be? Because, I mean, I'm assuming the men who are having these issues, they want to have sex, but the wife does not want to.
Well, I think what I see, it happens all the time. Men can have a bang out brawl with their wife, arguing, and they want to have sex. Well, for the woman, that's the last thing she wants to do after they've had a big fight. We're just built differently. Our biology is different. Men can be angry and frustrated and then want to have sex to feel better. Women are repulsed by that. They don't want to have sex when they've just had an argument. They want that emotional connection. And that's what leads to the breakdown of the marriage.
Do you find that the partners are still physically attractive to each other?
I think both can be true. I think, in some couples, they're still physically attracted to one another. And when things are good, very often they'll go on vacation and have wonderful times together and be very sexually active. When they come back to their real life and they can't function. There are other cases where, people do let themselves go. They get frustrated. They stop thinking about what they're eating and stop exercising, and they become very unattractive. I think that's less of a problem for women with the man than the man with the woman.
Why is that?
I think women are just less visually stimulated than men. Men are very visually stimulated. Our whole advertising industry is based on that. We are very visual people, men. So we are attracted to the physical looks less so than the woman. She cares usually less about that than the man does. So if a man has lost his hair or he's a little overweight, that's not usually a concern to a woman.
Is having a long marriage or just having a marriage, is that a victory?
It's a good question. I wouldn't say necessarily just by virtue of having a long marriage, it's a victory. I think it's certainly an accomplishment. If people can figure this out over a long period of time, it's an accomplishment. I think victory is when people are living the life that they want to live. I think that's a real victory. If they can do that together over many years, then yeah, I would say that's a huge victory.